The first thing my father said to me after 11 months of silence was, "Don't block the valet lane. Not hello. Not good to see you. Not even the kind of stiff little nod people give the dentist when they know a bill is coming." Just that. I stood beside the circular driveway of the Gentry estate with one black duffel over my shoulder and my tactical medical kit in my right hand. The kit was old, scuffed at the corners, and still had a strip of faded tan tape across the top where somebody had written Genji in black marker years ago. The letters had been rubbed thin from dust, rain, sand, blood, and the kind of nights people back home later called service, because the real words made them uncomfortable. Behind me, a white catering van tried to squeeze past a row of polished SUVs. In front of me, my father's house glowed like every bad decision in Savannah had been washed, waxed, and given a liquor license. Music spilled out through the open French doors. Glasses clinked. Women laughed in that careful, expensive way that never showed too much teeth. Men in navy jackets stood near the front steps holding bourbon like they were personally defending the Constitution. A gold sign beside the entry read, Sutton Gentry and Bridget Carlyle Pre-Wedding Cocktail Reception Gentry Hall. Somebody had paid $1,850 for that sign. I knew because my father had accidentally copied me on the invoice before removing me from the email thread 12 minutes later. Classic Redmond Gentry. He could overlook a daughter for years, but never a billing mistake. My father stood near the portico with one hand on Sutton's shoulder, presenting him to a state senator, 2 county commissioners, and a retired judge who had once called me sweetheart while asking where the restroom was. Redmond was in his favorite charcoal suit, the one he wore when he wanted bankers to believe he still slept well. Sutton stood beside him, taller than I remembered, broader too, with his perfect haircut and that practiced half-smile he used whenever someone might be rich enough to matter. Pinned inside his open dinner jacket, visible enough to be noticed but not so visible that anyone could accuse him of showing off, was his Ranger combat patch, subtle as a marching band in a funeral home. I saw it before I saw his face. That patch had survived fire, mud, and a man screaming through clenched teeth while I dragged him by the back of his vest across rock that tore open my palms. That patch had been pressed under my knee while I packed a wound that would not stop bleeding. That patch had disappeared into smoke on Ridge 404, and for 3 years, I had let my brother wear the story that belonged to the people who did not make it off that ridge. There was something else from that night, something Sutton never knew I kept. A small piece of metal, dull and rusted now, sealed inside my medical kit beneath a roll of compressed gauze. It was not valuable. It would not impress a senator. It would not look good in a shadow box above a fireplace. But before this story is over, that piece of metal would do what my silence never could. It would tell the room exactly who had been brave, who had been lucky, and who had spent years mistaking both for the same thing. For the moment I kept walking. A valet in a red vest reached for my duffel. He could not have been older than 19. "I've got it," I said. He looked relieved. "Yes, Mom, that one still hit weird." I had been called captain in places where the floor shook from mortar fire, docked by men with blood in their teeth, and once, very clearly, the mean lady with the scissors by a 19-year-old private who did not appreciate me cutting off his $96 tactical pants. Mom felt like something you said to a woman buying peaches. I crossed the drive toward the steps. My father's eyes slid over me once, quick and flat, like I was a stain he planned to have removed after the guests left. "Ainsley," he said, not loudly enough for anyone important to hear. "You're late. I came straight from the airport. You were supposed to be here by 4. My connecting flight out of Charlotte sat on the runway for 43 minutes. His mouth tightened. Redmond hated explanations because they interfered with blame. Sutton finally turned. For half a second, something passed across his face. Surprise, maybe, or irritation. Hard to tell. My brother had learned to polish both until they looked like confidence. "Well, look who made it," he said, the Army's favorite nurse. The senator chuckled because men like that laughed first and understood later, if ever. I set my medical kit down beside my boot. "Combat medic, right?" Sutton said, lifting his glass. "Sorry, combat medic, big difference." It was to the people bleeding that killed the chuckle. Not badly, just enough to make the senator look into his drink as if a tiny legal opinion might be floating in it. My father stepped in fast. "Ainsley has always been dramatic about job titles. She helped in medical support. Important work, of course. Very organized. I had once restarted a man's breathing with one hand while using the other to hold pressure on an artery because we had run out of clean hands. But yes, I also labeled supplies. Wouldn't want to ignore the clerical arts. Bridget appeared at the top of the steps in a pale blue dress that probably cost more than my first car. She was beautiful in the way expensive rooms are beautiful, cold, arranged, and not meant for touching. Her blonde hair sat in a low knot, and a diamond bracelet flashed at her wrist every time she moved her champagne flute. She looked me up and down, stopping at my boots. "Oh," she said, "you came dressed for labor." I looked at her heels. "You came dressed for a hostage exchange." Her smile froze just long enough for me to enjoy it. Sutton coughed into his drink. My father did not find it funny. Redmond only enjoyed humor when he was the one using it to cut someone smaller. Bridget recovered quickly. "We're just so glad you could be here. Sutton told me you were doing clinic work somewhere. A veterans rehab center outside Macon." "How sweet," she said, using the word like a napkin she planned to throw away. Before I could answer, a black Mercedes Sprinter pulled up behind me. A driver opened the side door, and out came 3 of Bridget's relatives, each carrying the sort of luggage people buy when they want strangers to know they have never worried about overdraft fees. I counted 6 matching cream suitcases, 2 garment bags, and 1 leather trunk with brass corners. A woman in pearls stepped down and glanced toward me. "Is she staff?" she asked Bridget. The question landed clean, no hesitation, no shame. Just a woman sorting the room into people who mattered and people who moved things. Bridget's eyes flicked to my medical kit, then to my father. Redmond did not correct her. He did not say, "That is my daughter." He did not say, "She served this country." He did not say anything a father with a spine might have found lying around in his mouth. Instead, he pointed at the luggage. "Ainsley, take Mrs. Carlyle's bags to the east guest rooms." The conversations nearest the steps softened but did not stop. That was the Savannah way. Public cruelty was acceptable as long as nobody raised their voice. I looked at him. "Excuse me?" He smiled then, but not at me, at the senator, at the judge, at the money gathered on his front lawn. "You heard me," he said. "Don't stand there with that combat lunchbox. Make yourself useful." A small sound came from somewhere behind me. One of the caterers had dropped a tray. Broken glass scattered across the stone drive, bright little pieces sliding under the Mercedes tire. Nobody moved. My father's hand stayed in the air, still pointing. Sutton watched over the rim of his glass, the ranger patch sitting against his chest like it had earned the right to judge me. I bent down, picked up my medical kit, and felt the rusted piece of metal shift inside. For 1 second, I thought about opening it right there. I straightened up instead, lifted the first suitcase without saying a word, and carried it through the front doors. By the time the last guest wandered upstairs to freshen up before dinner, my shoulders were sore for reasons that had nothing to do with luggage. I'd hauled wounded soldiers twice my size over broken ground. Carrying designer suitcases wasn't physically hard. What weighed more was watching my own father thank me with the same expression people give a hotel employee who finally brings extra towels. Dinner was held in the formal dining room, where nobody actually ate unless there were at least 10 people around to admire the silverware. The table could seat 16. Tonight, there were only 5 of us. Redmond sat at the head, Sutton to his right, Bridget beside him, and I was placed halfway down the opposite side. My mother's chair remained empty, as it had for nearly 8 years. Nobody mentioned it anymore. The house had quietly learned to pretend empty spaces were furniture. A server poured sparkling water into crystal glasses before disappearing through the swinging kitchen door. I reached automatically for my napkin. Combat habits never really leave you. Sit where you can see every entrance. Know where the exits are. Keep your hands free. Bridget noticed. "You still do that military thing." "What thing?" "Scanning every room." "I like knowing where the bathrooms are." Sutton laughed. "Sure." The appetizers arrived. Seared scallops with corn puree arranged so carefully they looked like they needed legal protection before anybody touched them. Redmond lifted his wine glass. "To Sutton and Bridget." Everyone echoed him. "To Sutton and Bridget." I raised my water. Nobody noticed. Conversation drifted through wedding vendors, guest lists, seating charts, and honeymoon plans in Tuscany. Sutton complained about having to spend another $12,600 because Bridget wanted imported floral arrangements instead of local ones. "It'll be worth it," Bridget said. "It better be." Redmond smiled proudly. "My son understands investment." I took another sip of water. Apparently, hauling defense contracts worth millions required genius. Hauling people out of combat required better posture. Halfway through the entree, Sutton stood. I almost forgot. He walked toward the far wall where a walnut display case hung beneath recessed lighting. Inside sat photographs, challenge coins, certificates, and the Ranger combat patch, mounted in black velvet, centered like it belonged in the Smithsonian. A brass plate underneath read, Ranger Combat Pochkanar Province, Courage Under Fire. Bridget looked at it with open admiration. I still love hearing this story. Redmond nodded toward several framed newspaper articles nearby. Tell it again. Sutton pretended to hesitate. Oh, Dad, these stories deserve repeating. Of course they did. He turned toward us. We were running patrol through Kunar province. Not exactly. We walked straight into an ambush. Closer. RPGs. No. Machine guns. Some. Mortars coming in from every direction. Yes. There wasn't anywhere to hide. That part was true. He rested one hand beneath the patch. My squad was getting cut apart. I watched his fingers. Those fingers had once been white from blood loss. I remember thinking, he paused dramatically, this is probably where I die. Bridget reached over and squeezed his arm. Oh, honey. He gave her the practiced smile of a man who had rehearsed this story often enough to know exactly where sympathy arrived. But I stayed in the fight. No. I kept my men together. No. I got everybody home. Definitely not. The room stayed quiet. Even the servers had slowed down near the kitchen doors. Sutton loved an audience. I still remember carrying one of my teammates over my shoulder while bullets hit the rocks around us. My hand tightened around the water glass. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me to remember exactly how impossible that sentence was. His femur had been shattered. He couldn't have carried a backpack. He certainly hadn't carried another soldier. He continued, You don't really understand life until you've seen blood on your own hands. Redmond looked toward me. That's something civilians never appreciate. I almost smiled. Civilians. Interesting choice. Bridget leaned forward. I can't imagine surviving something like that. You don't, Sutton answered. You just react. He pointed toward the patch. That thing reminds me every day that courage isn't something people talk about. Then his eyes landed on me. It's something you earn. The table grew quieter. I guess it's hard to explain unless you've actually been where the real fighting happened. I met his eyes. I imagine it is. He mistook my answer for agreement. You know what I always respected about your army job? I don't. It suited you. How? Redmond chuckled. Sutton continued. Medical paperwork, base clinics, office schedules. Bridget nodded. Stable. Exactly. He cut another piece of steak. Nothing wrong with that. I let him keep talking. But some jobs exist because somebody else is taking the real risks. There it was. Not just disrespect. Hierarchy. His version of the military had heroes and assistants. Apparently I belonged with the assistants. I've always said, Sutton continued, people confuse wearing a uniform with serving in combat. Redmond raised his fork. That's true. You can spend an entire enlistment behind a desk. Another nod from my father. And there's nothing shameful about that. He smiled toward me. As long as you're honest about what you actually did. I picked up my water. Glass stayed perfectly steady. Years ago, a surgeon had complimented me after a mass casualty operation. You've got the calmest hands I've ever seen. He assumed it was talent. It wasn't. Once you've tried stitching an artery, while mortar rounds shake dirt into the wound, dinner conversations lose most of their ability to rattle you. Bridget finally asked the question she'd obviously wanted to ask since I arrived. So what exactly did you do? I answered honestly. I kept people alive. She smiled politely. In hospitals? Sometimes. Mostly clinics? No. Sutton waved dismissively. Field medicine sounds exciting until you realize most of it is paperwork. I looked at him. You think that's what combat medicine is? I know enough. No, I said quietly. You know the version people clap for. Silence. He leaned back. So educate me. I didn't. There are nights that belong to the living. There are nights that belong to the dead. Ridge 404 belonged to the second group. I wasn't about to drag 6 ghosts into my father's dining room so Sutton could win another argument. He laughed. See? Redmond frowned. What? She can't. Bridget looked confused. What do you mean? Sutton smiled wider. Because there isn't anything to tell. He pointed toward the Ranger patch again. Real combat leaves stories. Then he pointed at me. Administrative services leaves. Silence. The words hung there. I took another drink. Still steady, still calm. Still breathing. Sutton wasn't finished. You know what the military gets wrong these days, Redmond answered before anyone else could. Politics, exactly, Sutton nodded. They keep lowering standards. Bridget shifted slightly. Sutton, no, seriously. He looked directly at me. They're so worried about checking diversity boxes that they forget what the job actually is. I said nothing. They put women into combat environments because it looks good in recruiting ads. He shrugged. But when bullets start flying, he tapped his own chest. People like me end up doing the saving. Another pause. Then he delivered the line he clearly believed. Women in uniform exist to fill administrative quotas. His smile disappeared. They have no idea what it actually means to save someone's life under fire. Nobody spoke. Not my father, not Bridget, not even the servers. I looked at the Ranger combat patch hanging proudly on the wall. Then I looked back at the man who owed his heartbeat to the pair of bloody trauma shears still sitting inside my medical kit upstairs. I finished my water, set the glass gently onto the table, and folded my hands in my lap. Neither one of them noticed they had just declared war against the only witness who knew exactly what had happened on Ridge 404. I left the house before sunrise the next morning and didn't tell anyone where I was going. The gravel under my boots sounded too loud in the quiet, so I took the long way around the side drive, past the carriage house where I'd been staying since I got back. It used to be where my mother kept her gardening tools. Now it was where inconvenient family members got parked. The Veterans Rehab Center sat 42 minutes outside Savannah, just past a stretch of road where the cell signal dropped to 1 bar and stayed there like it had given up trying. They didn't ask questions when I showed up. Places like that rarely do. By 9:20, I was resetting a knee brace for a guy named Marcus who kept joking that the VA paperwork would outlive him. By 10:05, I was helping a former Marine with a shoulder rotation that clicked every time he lifted past 90 degrees. By 11:37, I had blood on my hands again. Not much, just a reopened incision that needed pressure and clean gauze. It felt normal. It felt like work that made sense. Nobody there cared about cocktail parties or guest lists or whether your shoes matched your belt. They cared about range of motion, pain levels, and whether you could sleep through the night without waking up convinced something was still coming for you. I stayed longer than I planned. Not because they needed me. Because I didn't want to go back. At 2:14 p.m., Bridget Carlisle decided my room was hers to search. She didn't knock. People like her don't knock on doors they already believe they own. Sutton followed her in, more out of boredom than purpose, carrying a glass of something amber and expensive. He leaned against the doorway like this was entertainment. "You're sure she keeps it here?" he asked. "My mother said your mother had a pearl set she wore to every formal event," Bridget replied, already opening drawers. "Vintage. Real, not the department store kind." "She never gave it to me," Sutton said. "Of course she didn't," Bridget answered. "She probably hid it somewhere dramatic. That part, at least, wasn't wrong. My mother had a habit of putting important things in places nobody thought to look. Not out of paranoia, out of experience." Bridget moved quickly through the room, her fingers brushing past folded clothes, unopened mail, a small stack of medical journals I'd picked up from a thrift store in Macon for $3.75 each. "God," she muttered, lifting one. "You actually read these?" "Don't strain yourself," Sutton said. "It's mostly charts." She dropped it back onto the table like it might spread something. Her eyes landed on the footlocker at the end of the bed. It was Army issued. Olive drab. Metal edges dented from years of being thrown in and out of transport vehicles. A cheap combination lock hung from the latch, scratched but still intact. Bridget walked over slowly. "That's it." Sutton took a sip of his drink. "That's a footlocker. That's where she'd hide something valuable." He shrugged. "Or it's where she keeps boring things." Bridget crouched down, examining the lock. "You don't lock boring things." She was right. Sutton set his glass down on my desk. "Want me to grab bolt cutters?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her purse, pulled out a thin metal hairpin, and bent it slightly between her fingers. "Stand up," she said. He stepped closer, curious now. "You've done this before?" She smiled faintly. "I've lived in houses with secrets." The lock clicked open in under 10 seconds. Sutton let out a low whistle. "Remind me not to keep anything from you." Bridget didn't respond. She lifted the lid. The first thing she saw wasn't pearls, it was paper. Folders, sealed envelopes, documents stacked neatly, and tied with a faded green band. She pulled one free. "Service records. Let me see." Sutton leaned in as she flipped it open. Pages filled with blacked-out sections. Redacted lines, unit identifiers removed, locations replaced with blank blocks, the kind of paperwork that told you something happened without telling you what. "This is classified," Bridget said. "Or it used to be." She turned another page. Why would she keep this? Because she thinks it makes her look important. Bridget frowned. This doesn't say what she did, exactly. She dropped the file back into the locker. Pointless. Her hand moved deeper. She pulled out the uniform next. It had been folded carefully once, not recently. The fabric was stiff in places where it had dried wrong. The left sleeve was torn. The chest had a jagged patch where something had been ripped away. The name, Genty, gone. The stain beneath it had turned a dark, rusted brown. Bridget recoiled slightly. What is that? Sutton leaned closer. Looks like blood. She held the fabric up with 2 fingers, like it might stain her just by being near it. Why would she keep this? Sutton shrugged it again, but there was less humor in it now. Souvenir? That's disgusting. Bridget dropped it back into the trunk. It didn't land softly. The sound echoed in the small room. She reached in again. Her fingers closed around something metal. When she pulled it out, it was smaller than expected. Rust had eaten into the surface. The hinge was stiff. One handle had a faint notch, where something had chipped it years ago. Trauma shears. The kind used to cut through fabric, straps, sometimes things that weren't supposed to be cut at all. Bridget turned them over in her hand. These are filthy. Sutton looked at them longer than he had anything else. Those are standard issue. They look like they've been in a landfill. They've been used. She made a face. For what? He didn't answer. Not immediately. Something about the shears held his attention in a way the papers hadn't. Maybe it was the wear. Maybe it was the way the metal didn't shine anymore. Or maybe it was something quieter. Recognition without context. Bridget broke the silence. This is insane. She gestured toward the trunk. She's keeping random military junk like it means something. Sutton leaned back against the wall again, reaching for his drink. It means something to her. It's not even hers. Bridget snapped. Look at this. She grabbed the torn uniform again. There's no name, no unit, no proof any of this belongs to her. She dropped it back in harder this time. This is just trash. Sutton took another sip. She's always had a thing for attention. Bridget crossed her arms. No, this is worse than that. She looked around the room, at the footlocker, at the papers, at the shears. This is a pathological need to feel important. The words settled into the space like dust. She couldn't be anything impressive in real life, Bridget continued, her voice sharpening. So she collects pieces of other people's stories and pretends they're hers. Sutton didn't correct her, didn't question it, didn't even hesitate. He just nodded once, slow and certain. Sounds about right. Bridget closed the footlocker and snapped the lock back into place, not bothering to reset the combination. Get me gloves, she said. I don't want to touch any of that again. Sutton picked up his glass. You think the pearls are somewhere else. They have to be. She glanced once more at the trunk, her expression settling into something colder. We'll find them. Then she turned toward the door. Neither of them noticed the faint imprint left on the inside of the lid, pressed into the metal over years of opening and closing. 6 small marks, uneven. Like someone had counted something once, one by one, and then never stopped remembering. Upstairs, the room went quiet again. The footlocker sat where it always had. Locked, but no longer private. I found the lock already snapped shut when I got back, but the numbers were wrong. Not scrambled. Just off. It takes a certain kind of person to break into your things and still believe they're the victim. I didn't open it. Didn't need to. The dust along the lid had been disturbed. The angle of the latch was slightly bent. Someone had forced it, then tried to make it look like they hadn't. I washed my hands at the small sink in the corner, dried them on a towel that still smelled faintly of bleach, and left the room exactly as I found it. If they wanted to bring it into the open, they would. People like Sutton don't break into your life quietly. They stage it. Sunday brunch at Savannah Crest Country Club started at 11:30. By 11:47, Sutton had already shaken hands with 9 board members, introduced Bridget to 4 wives, and made sure 3 different people had seen the Ranger combat patch he was now wearing on a custom-tailored blazer. That patch was getting more airtime than most elected officials. The dining room overlooked a stretch of manicured green that looked like it had never seen dirt in its life. White tablecloths. Polished silver. Mimosas poured like they were part of the water system. I sat halfway down the table again. different room, same seat. Redmond stood near the head, holding court with a cluster of men who had the kind of smiles that came with annual bonuses and quiet agreements. Federal supply chain is tightening, he was saying, which is exactly why reliability matters. One of the board members nodded. And your son's military background speaks for itself. Redmond cut in smoothly. Of course it did. Sutton joined them just in time to catch the end of that sentence. Gentlemen, he said, raising his glass slightly. Appreciate that. He didn't look at me. Not yet. That would come later. It always does. Bridget sat beside me, close enough that I could smell whatever perfume cost more than my monthly rent. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. Her silence had weight now. She knew something. At 12:06, the plates were cleared. At 12:09, Redmond turned toward me for the first time. Ainsley. Just my name, that was all the warning I got. Every conversation within earshot softened, not stopped, just adjusted. People leaned in without looking like they were leaning. Sutton stepped closer, resting one hand casually against the back of his chair. We had an interesting discovery yesterday. I said nothing. Redmond continued. Your room, there it was. Bridget finally spoke. We were looking for my mother's pearl set. Her tone made it sound like I had personally hidden it out of spite. Instead, Sutton said, we found something else. He reached into his jacket. Not subtle, never subtle. He pulled out the trauma shears. Cleaned, apparently. Or at least wiped down enough to pass in public. He held them up between two fingers like evidence in a courtroom. These look familiar? A couple of heads turned. One of the board members leaned slightly to get a better view. I recognized him. He'd once donated $50,000 to a veterans charity and then spent the rest of the evening making sure everyone knew about it. I looked at the shears. Yes, Sutton smiled. Good. He turned slightly so the table could see them. Because from what I can tell, these didn't come from any official record tied to you. Redmond added, your service file doesn't support what you're implying. Of course it didn't. That was the point. Bridget leaned in just enough to be heard. They were in a locked trunk, along with other items. She let the word hang, items, like they'd found a box of stolen silver. Sutton set the shears down on the table in front of me. You know what this looks like? I didn't answer. It looks like someone went to an army surplus store and picked up a few props. A low chuckle from someone across the table. Maybe a little online shopping, he continued. Build yourself a story. Redmond nodded. It would explain the inconsistencies. Bridget crossed her arms. And the condition of those things. Sutton leaned forward. You want people to think you were in combat. I met his eyes. You want them to believe you were there when it mattered. Another pause. Then he delivered it clean. But you weren't. The room held still. You worked in medical administration, he continued. Clerical support, base-level operations. He tapped the shears lightly against the table. These don't belong to you. I let the silence stretch. Let them sit in it. Let them fill it with whatever version of me made them comfortable. Redmond stepped in again. We're not accusing you of anything malicious. Which meant they absolutely were. But misrepresenting military service, especially in a setting like this, can be damaging. To him, to his contracts, to his reputation. Not to me, never to me. Bridget added, quieter now but sharper, it's embarrassing. That word carried more weight for her than anything Sutton had said. Embarrassment. Not lies, not truth, not harm. Just how it looked. Sutton straightened. Go ahead. I looked at him. Explain it. I didn't. Not because I couldn't. Because I wouldn't. There are nights you don't explain. Not to people who treat them like talking points. Not to men who wear your blood like decoration. Not to a father who measures truth by how well it performs in a room full of donors. I looked at Sutton first, really looked. At the way his hand rested too casually near the patch on his chest. At the way he believed every word he'd just said. Then I looked at my father. At the man who had just turned his daughter into a liability in front of a dozen people who would forget my name by dessert. I picked up the shears, turned them once in my hand. Set them back down exactly where they had been. Then I spoke. Calm, even. Final, some debts are paid in blood, Sutton. The words landed quiet, no drama, no volume, just weight. Others are paid in silence. I held his gaze. Be careful which one you try to audit. No one laughed, no one moved. Sutton's smile didn't disappear, but it didn't quite hold either. And for the first time since I'd walked into that house, something small and uncertain flickered behind his eyes. Not understanding, not yet, but doubt. And doubt is where the truth always starts to breathe. That flicker in his eyes didn't last long. By the time dessert came out, Sutton was laughing. Again. By the time the check was signed, 4,899 before tip, my father had already moved on to damage control. He didn't speak to me in the parking lot. Didn't need to, his assistant did. At 3:18 p.m. a text came through, where the uniform provided, report to service entrance by 6 p.m. Do not engage with guests. No name, no signature, just instructions. That was Redmond's version of parenting. The wedding gala wasn't really about the wedding, it was about the contract. Everyone knew it, even if nobody said it out loud. General Alistair Sinclair was flying in that afternoon. 4-star, Special Operations Command. The kind of man who didn't attend events unless there was a reason worth at least 8 figures. Redmond's firm had been bleeding quietly for months. A delayed shipment here. A failed audit there. A federal review that had stalled 2 of his largest contracts. He needed this one, not to grow, to survive. And Sutton. Sutton was the centerpiece. War hero, clean record, perfect smile. A man who could stand next to a general and look like he belonged there. There was just one problem. Me. At 5:52 p.m., I walked through the service entrance behind the ballroom. The uniform was hanging on a metal rack. Gray, cheap fabric, 2 sizes too loose. The kind of thing you buy in bulk for staff you don't plan on remembering. A folded name tag sat on the table beside it. No name printed, just a blank strip. I changed without rushing, folded my clothes carefully, set my boots beside the locker, slipped into the low black shoes they'd provided. They were half a size too small. Of course they were. When I stepped out, one of the catering managers handed me a clipboard. Coat check, he said. Stay by the entrance. Smile if people look at you. I took the clipboard. He didn't ask who I was. Didn't need to. In this room, the uniform decided that. By 6:27 p.m., the ballroom was full. 200 guests, maybe more, crystal chandeliers, live string quartet, champagne moving in steady circulation like oxygen. At 6:41, I took a navy wool coat from a woman who didn't look at my face. At 6:46, I hung a tuxedo jacket worth more than my entire duffel bag. At 6:52, I wrote claim ticket numbers in clean, even handwriting. People handed me their things without seeing me, which was the point. Invisible is a strategy. If you do it long enough, people start showing you exactly who they are. I watched Sutton from across the room. He moved like he owned the place, laughing, shaking hands, adjusting his cufflinks, making sure the ranger patch sat just right under the light. Bridget stayed close to him, guiding conversations, redirecting attention, controlling the flow of people like she was managing traffic at a private airport. My father floated between clusters, smiling harder than usual. Too hard. Every now and then, he glanced toward the entrance, waiting, calculating, counting the minutes until the general arrived. At 7:18, a man in a dark suit handed me his coat and said, "Thank you." He looked me in the eye, not long, just enough. That was rare, I nodded. "You're welcome. Small things like that stay with you longer than they should." At 7:32, Bridget appeared beside me. I hadn't seen her approach. That was intentional. She stood close enough that no one else could hear. Walk with me, not a request. I handed the clipboard to another server and followed her through the side corridor into the pantry. The noise from the ballroom softened behind the swinging door. Fluorescent lights replaced chandeliers. Stacks of glassware lined the shelves. This was where the real work happened. Bridget turned to face me. Up close, her smile was gone. "You're going to stay exactly where you are tonight." "I am." "Good." She studied my uniform. "Honestly, this suits you better." I didn't respond. She stepped closer. "I need to be very clear about something." Her voice dropped lower. "General Sinclair is not here for you. I'm aware. You will not approach him. I wasn't planning to. You will not speak to him." I held her gaze. "About what?" She didn't hesitate. "About anything." There it was. Not curiosity. Not confusion. Control. "If anyone from his team asks you a question," she continued, "you answer it as staff." "I am staff." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Don't be clever, I wasn't. Not yet." She took another step in. "If you say one word, one about my situation." She ignored the tone. "Your so-called medical service, your little stories, your collection upstairs." The word collection almost made me laugh. She leaned in close enough that I could see the faint line where her foundation met her skin. "You will be removed from this property tonight." I didn't move. "You will not come back." Still nothing. "And you will lose access to your mother's garden." That one landed, not visibly, but it landed. She watched for a reaction, didn't get one. Good. That garden had been the only place in this entire estate that ever felt like something belonged to me. My mother had planted it herself. Every oak, every white camellia, every stubborn rosebush that refused to die even when it probably should have. Bridget straightened. I'm glad we understand each other. I nodded once. Perfectly. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing. I waited. She looked back over her shoulder. People like you don't get to rewrite reality just because you want to feel important. Then she was gone. The door swung shut behind her. The pantry went quiet again. I stood there for a second longer than necessary. Then I reached into my pocket and adjusted the edge of the blank name tag. Still empty, still clean, still waiting. Out in the ballroom, the music shifted. The kind of shift that meant something important had just entered the room. I stepped back into the hallway, picked up the clipboard, and returned to my place by the door. Invisible. Exactly where they wanted me, and exactly where I needed to be. Because what was about to happen next wasn't just about a contract. It was about truth catching up with a lie that had been living comfortably for far too long. What happened in that room would have been shocking on its own. But standing there, watching Sutton adjust that patch, one more time, I couldn't help thinking about another case we once covered on this channel. One where the truth didn't just embarrass someone, it completely dismantled everything they had built. If you're paying attention between minutes 45 and 55, you might catch that story waiting for you. I picked up another coat, wrote another number, and waited for the moment someone finally looked close enough to see what had been standing in front of them the entire time. I handed off the last coat, set the clipboard down, and walked out through the service corridor without asking permission. No one stopped me. That's the thing about being invisible. People don't question your exits either. The hallway lights buzzed faintly overhead as I moved past the kitchen, past the storage room, past the narrow staircase that led up to the carriage house. My feet still hurt from the shoes, but I didn't slow down. By the time I reached my door, the music from the ballroom had dulled into something distant and muffled. I locked it behind me, not out of fear, out of clarity. The room hadn't changed since I left it that morning. The footlocker sat where it always did. The bed was still made. The small desk still held the same stack of papers, everything exactly as they had rearranged it and pretended they hadn't touched. I didn't look at the trunk. Didn't need to. I already knew what was inside. Instead, I walked to the closet and pulled out the garment bag. It hung there untouched, exactly where I had left it when I arrived. Zipped, quiet, waiting. I set it on the bed and opened it slowly. The uniform inside didn't look like it belonged in this house. U.S. Army service uniform, dark blue, structured, clean lines that didn't apologize for taking up space. I ran my hand down the sleeve once, smoothing out a crease that wasn't really there. Then I changed. The gray catering uniform came off first. It hit the floor without ceremony. The shirt, the slacks, the cheap apron, all of it, gone. I stepped into the uniform piece by piece, shirt first, then trousers, then the jacket. Each movement precise, not rushed, not hesitant, just practiced. There are rituals you learn in the military that have nothing to do with combat. How to fold a flag, how to lace boots so they don't come undone at the worst possible time, how to wear a uniform so that it doesn't just fit your body, it fits your history. I stood in front of the mirror and adjusted the collar, checked the alignment. Then I reached into the garment bag again. The medals were wrapped separately. They always are. I unrolled the cloth carefully. Combat Medical Badge, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, with Valor. I didn't rush this part. Every ribbon has a place, every placement has a measurement. A 1/4 inch too high is wrong. A 1/4 inch too low is wrong. Precision matters, because these aren't decorations. They're records. I pinned the Combat Medical Badge first, centered, steady, then the Purple Heart, then the Bronze Star. Each one clicked into place with a soft final sound. I adjusted them once, twice, perfect. The woman in the mirror didn't look like the one who had been standing at coat check 20 minutes ago. Same face, same eyes, different posture, different weight. I picked up the trauma shears from the desk. They were clean now, still worn, still real. I turned them once in my hand, then set them back down. They didn't belong on the uniform. They never did. Some things you carry, some things you don't display. I took one last look at the room, at the footlocker, at the life I had allowed them to shrink into something small enough to ignore. Then I turned off the light and walked out. The staircase into the main ballroom curved wide and open, designed for entrances that mattered. Bridget had planned to walk down it later that night. Perfect lighting, perfect timing, perfect audience. I stepped onto it without asking. At first, nobody noticed. The music was still playing, conversation still flowing, glasses still clinking. Halfway down, someone did. A woman near the bar stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes moved from my shoulder to my chest to my face. Then she went quiet. The man she'd been talking to followed her gaze. Then another, and another. Sound doesn't disappear all at once, thread by thread. A laugh cuts off early, a sentence stops halfway through. A glass doesn't get set down as loudly as it should. By the time I reached the last step, the room had changed. Not completely silent, but close enough that you could feel it. My father was standing near the center of the room, still smiling, still talking. Until he wasn't. He turned, saw me. And for the first time in my life, Redmond Gentry didn't have a response ready. The color drained out of his face in real time. Crimson, to pale, to something closer to gray. Sutton followed his gaze. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then his eyes dropped. To the medals. To the badge. To the uniform that didn't leave room for interpretation. His hand moved instinctively toward his own chest, toward the ranger patch. For the first time since I'd walked into this house, it looked small. Bridget stood beside him, frozen. Her expression didn't crack, but it shifted, calculation replacing certainty. The kind of shift people make when the story they've been telling themselves starts to fall apart. I didn't stop walking, didn't slow down, didn't look away. Every step was measured, controlled, final. I crossed the floor and came to a stop near one of the marble columns, not at the center, not beside my father, not next to Sutton. I didn't need the spotlight. The uniform had already taken it. Nobody spoke, nobody moved, and in that silence, something changed. Not in me, in the room. Because for the first time that night, I wasn't invisible anymore. And there was nothing any of them could do about it. I hadn't taken more than 3 steps across the marble floor when my father's voice cut through the silence. Ainsley. Not loud, but sharp enough to stop movement. I didn't turn immediately. That alone was new. When I did, Redmond was already walking toward me, Sutton right behind him, moving faster than usual, like he was trying to catch something before it got out of control. Which, to be fair, he was. My father stopped a few feet away. This isn't the place. His voice stayed controlled, but the edges were starting to show. Come with me, not a request. A command dressed up in polite language for the sake of the room. I followed, not because he told me to, because I was curious how far he was willing to go in private. They led me out through a side hallway and into the library. The door shut behind us with a soft, final click. The noise from the ballroom dropped instantly. Books lined the walls, most of them decorative. Leather spines no one had opened in years. A decanter sat untouched on a side table. This was where Redmond held conversations he didn't want recorded in anyone else's memory. Sutton didn't wait. What the hell do you think you're doing? No audience now, no performance, just anger. I leaned back slightly against the edge of the desk, standing. Don't do that, he snapped. Do what? Act like this is normal. I tilted my head. It is for me. His jaw tightened. No, it's not. This, he gestured at my uniform, the medals, the entire existence I had apparently hidden too well. This is a stunt. My father stepped in before Sutton could escalate further. You're creating a scene. I walked down the stairs. You know exactly what you're doing, Redmond said. Yes. That stopped at him for half a second. Sutton stepped closer, too close now. This is about the brunch, isn't it? No, you didn't like being called out. I looked at him. I didn't like being lied about. His voice rose. No one lied. You did. That's not what this is, he snapped. This is you showing up in a costume trying to embarrass me in front of 200 people. I almost smiled. Costume. Right. My father raised his hand slightly. Enough. You're gonna take that off. Just like that. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just removal. No, the word landed clean, simple, final. Sutton laughed once, sharp and humorless. See? This is what I'm talking about. He started pacing. This is exactly the kind of thing people do when they've convinced themselves of something that isn't real. He turned back toward me. You've built this whole narrative in your head, combat, danger, heroics. I didn't build anything. Then where is it? He shot back. Where's the proof? Didn't answer. He spread his arms. Exactly. Redmond stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're putting us in a difficult position. Us. Always us. Never me. There are people out there who matter, he continued. People who are evaluating this family, this business, based on what they see tonight. And what do they see? He didn't hesitate. Confusion. Sutton cut in. They see someone trying to steal something she didn't earn. That word again. Steal. He stepped right up to me now, close enough that I could smell the scotch on his breath. You think wearing that uniform makes you equal to what I did? Equal. That was the problem. Not truth, not facts. Status. I don't think about you at all, I said. That hit harder than anything else I could said. His face changed, not anger this time, something sharper, something personal. Take it off. No, I'm not asking. I know. His hand came up fast, finger pointed straight at my chest, at the medals. At the space above my heart where the bronze star sat perfectly aligned. This is a disgrace. His voice cracked just slightly on the last word. Not whackness. Pressure. You're standing in there, he continued, louder now, wearing fake medals, pretending to be something you're not, on my wedding night. My father didn't stop him, didn't correct him, didn't even look at me. Sutton's finger pressed forward, not hard, but deliberate. You don't get to wear that. I didn't move. You don't get to stand next to me looking like that. Still nothing. You don't get to take my sacrifice and turn it into your little performance. There it was, ownership. He believed it. Every word. I watched his breathing. Fast, uneven. Anger does that. It gives you rhythm you don't control. I matched it, not visibly, just enough. In, out, the same way I had once matched a man's breathing while trying to keep him conscious through shock. Same pace, same focus, same silence. Then I spoke, quiet enough that he had to lean in to hear it. I wore this uniform to the graves of 6 men who didn't make it off that ridge, Sutton. The room shifted, not physically, but something in it moved. I didn't look away. I will not strip it off for a man who ran from it. Silence, not the kind from before. This one had weight. Sutton didn't step back, didn't speak. But something behind his eyes cracked open just enough to let uncertainty in. My father exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath longer than he realized. For the first time since we walked into that room, he looked at me, really looked, not as a problem, not as a distraction, but as something he didn't fully understand anymore. I pushed off the desk, straightened my jacket once, precise, controlled. Then I walked past both of them and opened the door. The noise of the ballroom rushed back in, louder now, sharper, real. And this time when I stepped through it, I wasn't walking in as someone they could quietly move out of the way. I was walking in as the problem they had just failed to contain. I stepped back into the ballroom just as the music cut clean in the middle of a note. Not faded, not transitioned. Stopped. That kind of stop only happens when something more important than entertainment walks into the room. Every head turned toward the entrance at the same time. The grand mahogany doors opened wide, pushed by 2 men in dark suits, who didn't look like guests and didn't pretend to be. Then he walked in. General Alistair Sinclair didn't need an introduction. He carried it with him. Tall. Controlled. Every movement measured like it had already been evaluated before it happened. His uniform wasn't flashy, but it didn't need to be. 4 stars sat on his shoulders with the kind of quiet authority that made people straighten up without being told. 2 federal security officers followed just behind him, scanning the room without turning their heads. The air shifted. Not dramatically, subtly. Like the room had just remembered it was being watched by someone who didn't care about its opinions. My father moved first. Of course he did. Redmond Gentry didn't hesitate when opportunity walked through a door. He cut through the crowd with Sutton's right behind him, both of them already adjusting posture, expression, tone, switching into the version of themselves they believed powerful people expected to see. Patriotic, confident, useful. By the time they reached the general, Redmond's smile was flawless. General Sinclair, he said, extending his hand. Redmond Gentry. It's an honor. Sutton stepped in just half a beat later, perfectly timed. Sutton Gentry, sir. We've been looking forward to this evening. His voice had changed, deeper, steadier, practiced. The kind of voice you use when you want someone to believe you belong in their world. Redmond continued, not missing rhythm. My firm specializes in military logistics and supply chain optimization. We've prepared a proposal that aligns directly with. The general didn't take his hand, didn't even look at it. Redmond's arm stayed extended for a fraction of a second, too long before he slowly lowered it, pretending the moment hadn't happened. Sutton tried to recover. Sir, I served in Kunar province. Still nothing. General Sinclair had stopped walking, completely, right there in the center of the room, and for a second, nobody understood why. Then his head turned, slowly, deliberately, Eyes moved past Redmond, past Sutton, past Bridget, across the room, until they found me, standing near the marble column, exactly where I had been, still, back straight, hands at my sides. The room followed his gaze like it was attached to something. People turned. Conversations died again, this time faster. Because confusion had turned into tension, and attention has gravity. I didn't move, didn't shift, didn't adjust. I stood the way I had been trained to stand when someone of rank entered the room. Not for him, for the uniform. The general took one step forward, then another. Not toward my father, not toward Sutton, toward me. Behind him, one of the security officers glanced briefly at Redmond, then repositioned slightly to clear the path. That was the moment the room understood something wasn't going according to plan. Redmond tried again. General, if I could just... Ignored. Completely. Sutton's jaw tightened. Sir, I was part of. Still nothing. General Sinclair didn't break stride, each step measured, unhurried, uninterrupted, until he stopped feet in front of me. Close enough to see, close enough to confirm. His eyes moved once. From my face, to my shoulder, to the metals aligned over my heart. They stayed there for half a second longer than casual recognition. Then came back up. There was no confusion in his expression. No doubt, just certainty. Behind him, the entire ballroom held its breath. My father didn't move, couldn't. Sutton stood frozen, his hand still hovering near his own chest like he'd forgotten what it was doing there. Bridget watched, her expression calculating again. But this time, the math wasn't working. Because this wasn't part of any plan, she understood. I remained at parade rest, eyes forward, posture locked, not because I needed to impress anyone. Because discipline doesn't disappear just because the room gets uncomfortable. The general took one final step, stopped directly in front of me, the distance between us precise. Intentional. And for the first time since he entered the room, he spoke. Not loudly, but clearly enough that every person within 20 feet heard every word. Captain, one word. That was all it took. Not mom, not miss, not you, Captain. The title landed in the room like something heavy and undeniable. Behind him, I heard a glass shift in someone's hand, a quiet, involuntary reaction, because titles like that don't get handed out casually. Not in that tone, not from a man like him. I didn't respond. Not yet. Not until it was complete. The general's posture changed. Subtle, but absolute. His back straightened, his shoulders squared. And then, he stopped breathing for just long enough that anyone who had ever worn a uniform would recognize what was about to happen. The room didn't know it yet, but it was already too late to stop it. Because whatever version of the story Redmond and Sutton had built for the last 3 years, it had just run headfirst into someone who had actually been there. Before anyone could speak, his hand moved. Not rushed, not hesitant, precise. General Alistair Sinclair's posture snapped into a perfect vertical line, the kind you don't fake and don't forget. His right hand came up in one clean motion, fingers aligned, palm angled just right, and he saluted me. Not casually, not politely. Deep, sharp, absolute. The kind of salute that carries weight. The kind you give when you know exactly who you're standing in front of. The room broke without making a sound. 200 people watching something they didn't understand, but knew mattered. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Nobody even shifted their weight. Because even if they didn't know military protocol, they understood hierarchy when they saw it. And right now, it had just flipped. I returned the salute. Same precision, that's control. Same silence, that's... My hand dropped. His followed, and then he stepped forward. Not toward my father, not toward Sutton, past them, like they weren't there. Sutton didn't move out of the way, he just stopped existing in the general's path. General Sinclair walked right by him, close enough that Sutton had to turn slightly just to avoid contact. That small movement said more than anything else could have. The general stopped at my side. Close enough now that his voice didn't need to carry. But it did anyway. Because the room had gone so quiet, even a breath sounded like a decision. Captain Gentry. Not a question. A confirmation. Yes, sir. My voice didn't rise, didn't shake, didn't change. His eyes stayed on mine for a second. Then he nodded once. Small, respectful. The Pentagon has been searching for the combat medic of Ridge 404 for 3 years. Words moved through the room slowly. Like people needed time to process each part. Combat medic. Ridge 404. Searching 3 years. Behind him someone inhaled sharply. Sutton didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. General Sinclair continued. The man you dragged through 2 miles of mortar fire with a shattered femur owes his life to you. No embellishment, no performance. Just fact, clean, undeniable. I didn't look at Sutton, didn't need to. I could hear it. The shift, the crack. The moment a story stops holding together, the general finally turned his head, not fully, just enough. His gaze landed on Sutton's chest, on the Ranger combat patch, held there, for half a second. Then he looked back at me. I see your brother still wears the Ranger patch you saved for him. The sentence landed harder than anything before it. Because now it wasn't just truth. It was comparison. Sutton's hand dropped. The glass he'd been holding, Scotch, expensive, barely touched, slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor and shattered. Sharp, loud, final. The sound echoed through the ballroom like something breaking that couldn't be put back together. Sutton didn't bend to pick it up, didn't even look down. His knees gave slightly, not a full collapse, but enough for everyone to see, enough for him to feel it. Bridget stepped back without realizing she was doing it. One step, then another, distance. Instinctive. My father didn't speak, didn't move, didn't breathe. The man who controlled every room he walked into had just lost control of the only one that mattered. And he knew it. General Sinclair shifted his stance slightly, not relaxed, just settled. Like something unresolved had finally found its place. We reviewed the after-action reports, he said, still looking at me. What little wasn't redacted. A faint edge of something, respect maybe, touched his voice. Not many people could have done what you did that night. I didn't answer, didn't need to. Because this wasn't about recognition. It never had been. It was about truth. And truth had a way of showing up late, but never empty-handed. The general gave a small nod. Good to finally put a face to the name. Behind him, the room started to breathe again. Slowly, carefully. Like people weren't sure what they were allowed to do next. Conversations didn't resume. They rebuilt. Quietly, in fragments. Because nobody wanted to be the first one to pretend nothing had just happened. I stood where I was. Still. Centered. Not because I needed to prove anything. But because for the first time in that house, in that room, in that entire version of my life, I didn't have to shrink to make anyone else comfortable. And across from me, Sutton Gentry stood in a silence that no story, no patch, and no amount of borrowed courage could ever fill again. The room never fully recovered. It tried. You could see it in the way people picked their glasses back up, in the way conversations restarted in low, careful tones. Like everyone's was testing the ground before putting their full weight down. But something had already shifted too far, and it wasn't coming back. General Sinclair didn't stay long after that. He didn't need to. He turned to my father, finally acknowledging him, not as a host, not as a partner, but as a problem that required a clear answer. I've reviewed your firm's submissions, he said, voice even, controlled. Redmond straightened immediately, pulling himself back together. General, if there's anything we can clarify, there is. That stopped him. The general's tone didn't change, but it hardened. Misrepresentation of military credentials in federal contract discussions is not a clerical error. No room for interpretation. No room for negotiation. It's fraud. The word landed harder than anything that had been said all night. Redmond's face tightened. That's a misunderstanding. It's a disqualifier. Clean. Final. I'll be recommending that your firm be removed from consideration for all current and future Department of Defense contracts. Silence, not shock this time, impact. You could feel the numbers behind that sentence. Millions, gone. Years of positioning, gone. Reputation, gone. My father didn't argue again. He knew when something was over. Sutton didn't speak at all. He hadn't recovered enough to try. General Sinclair gave a small nod. Not to them. To me. Then he turned and walked out, his security detail falling in behind him like the room had already stopped mattering. The doors closed. And this time, nothing replaced the silence. At 8:12 p.m., Bridget took off her engagement ring. No speech, no tears. Just a quiet, deliberate motion at the edge of the ballroom where fewer people could see, but enough still did. She set the ring on the table in front of Sutton. I'm not marrying this, she said. Her voice wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. This? Sutton asked. She looked at him, really looked, for the first time. I can work with ambition, she said. I can work with strategy. I can even work with ego. A pause. But I don't build a life with a lie. He didn't respond, didn't defend himself. Didn't even reach for the ring. Bridget nodded once, like something had been confirmed. Then she walked away, not fast, not dramatic, just done. I didn't stay for the rest. There wasn't anything left for me there. No confrontation. No final argument, no closure they could give me. I went back to the carriage house, packed the same duffel I had arrived with. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, 1 pair of boots, medical kit. The garment bag stayed separate, carefully folded, placed on top. I paused once, just once, at the edge of the room, looking at the footlocker. Still there, still holding everything I had never said out loud. I didn't open it. Didn't need to. Some things aren't meant to be carried forward. I turned off the light and closed the door behind me, this time for good. Dawn came slow over Savannah. Soft light filtering through the oaks, catching on the Spanish moss like it had all the time in the world. I stood at the end of the driveway with my duffel in one hand and my keys in the other. The house sat behind me, quiet now, no music, no guests, no performance. Just a structure full of rooms that had spent years teaching me how to disappear inside them. I looked back once, not for them, for me, for the version of myself that had stayed too long. Then I got in the car, started the engine, and drove north, Washington, new assignment, new life, no audience, no explanation, just work that made sense. For 30 years, I believed that loving a family meant allowing myself to be erased so they could take up all the space in the room. I wore my silence like a heavy coat, letting them believe I was smaller than I was, because I thought standing at my full height would break something fragile in them. Maybe it would have. But that wasn't my responsibility. I didn't carry my brother off that ridge for recognition, and I didn't stay silent so he could build a life on top of something he didn't earn. Out there, none of that mattered. Not last names, not money, not who got introduced first at a party, just whether someone made it home. That was the only standard that counted. What I didn't understand back then, what that house finally taught me, is this. If you give everything without boundaries, people don't become grateful, they become entitled. They adjust to your silence. They start to expect it. And if you let them, they will rewrite your entire worth until it fits whatever version of you makes their life easier. That isn't humility, that's surrender. Honor doesn't come from a story you tell. And respect isn't something you negotiate over dinner. The uniform I wore that night didn't make me who I am. It just made it impossible for them to keep pretending I wasn't. But the real change didn't happen on that staircase. It happened the moment I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided not to listen. We don't owe silence to people who only value us when we stay quiet. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do, for them and for yourself, is to put the weight down, walk out, and not come back. The road opened up ahead of me, clear, uncomplicated. For the first time in a long time, it felt like mine.